Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. Today I'd like to talk about teaching U.S. history to homeschoolers. The teaching of American history is probably more important and controversial than ever. If you follow the news, you may notice that our country seems to be becoming increasingly divided. And a lot of this division, in my opinion, stems from the differences in how Americans view America and the history of the United States. That's why how you approach teaching U.S. history to our kids is really important. I would like to begin by saying that teaching the history of your own country is hard to do well. Hard in ways that teaching other subjects like math and science are not. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we're all human, and whether we admit it or not, we as human beings all have our own personal biases, and this can influence how you teach the history of any country, especially your own, and which narrative of history you decide to teach. Now, when I was growing up, the idea that there might be different narratives of American history didn't really occur to me. I still have my old U.S. history textbook from high school, The American Pageant by two well-known Stanford professors. I do remember someone telling me at the time that this book did have a certain political bias, but it certainly didn't take away my enjoyment of reading this book and studying American history. And yes, for you young people out there, books like this back then did teach us about slavery, women's rights, and what the United States did to Native Americans. But times have, of course, changed since I was in high school. And today, there seems to be two competing narratives of how U.S. history is being taught to our kids. The first narrative is what I would call the conservative narrative, that the United States is an exceptional country. In this narrative, the United States was founded in 1776 upon the principle that all men are created equal. The United States has never been perfect, but its founding principles have always been a beacon and a compass for those striving to make it a more perfect union. America, to many, has always stood for freedom for both Americans and immigrants from around the world, hoping to find a better life in a land of opportunity. Now, one textbook that embraces this narrative is titled Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story by Wilfred McClay. You can probably tell from the title that this book has a rather optimistic view of America. In fact, the author begins the book by writing, "Nothing about America better defines its distinctive character than the ubiquity of hope, a sense that the way things are initially given to us cannot be the final word about them, and that we can never settle for that. Even those who are bitterly critical of America and finds its hopes to be delusions cannot deny the enduring energy of those hopes and are not immune to their pull." Now, on the opposite end is what I would call the progressive narrative, that America is a systemically racist and unjust country that needs to be transformed. In this narrative, the story of the United States really began not in 1776, but in 1619 when the first black slaves arrived in Virginia. Since that time, the story of America has been a continuing story of oppression and injustice committed mostly by white men who, under the guise of liberty and freedom, oppressed blacks, Native Americans, and other groups for their own capitalist interests. A popular book that supports this perspective is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. You may have heard of this book. It was first published in 1980 and has arguably become the most famous and widely read book on American history in schools over the past 20 years. The book, according to the back cover, chronicles American history from the bottom up, throwing out the official narrative taught in schools. Now, the irony is that since its publication in 1980, the book has become the official narrative in many of our schools. Howard Zinn begins the book by telling us the story of Christopher Columbus, not as a brave explorer who discovered a new world, but as a brutal European who enslaved and then committed genocide against natives living in the Bahamas. The book then continues the theme of how the white men who ran America, who were traditionally looked upon as heroes, men like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, instead of fighting for freedom, were really only acting upon self-serving interests to preserve capitalism. And even when it comes to World War II, a war where you would think almost every American is proud of the United States role, Howard Zinn still manages to raise the question as to whether the United States was really that much better morally than the enemies it defeated. He opens that chapter on World War II, reminding readers that the United States itself had been an expansionist, imperialist power in places like Cuba and Hawaii. Now, had I read this book as a teenager without having read any other U.S. history, I can see how I might have grown up with a much more darker and negative view of America. Zinn was a very good writer, and he really knew how to make you feel as if he's letting you in on a secret that's never been taught before. So which narrative of U.S. history is the right one? But what I've concluded is that historical narratives aren't necessarily right or wrong or true or false. But what an effective polemicist or propagandist often does in presenting a particular narrative is that they selectively choose specific facts and emphasize certain truths, sometimes out of context, in order to support their own worldview. And they downplay others that don't. And this can happen no matter which side you're on. A good historian, in my opinion, should be able to look at different perspectives of the same events in history, examine facts in context, and then draw their own conclusion. That said, I think when kids are younger, they should start by learning history from perspectives that are as balanced and mainstream as possible. Now, I know this itself can be subjective, and it's really up to the parent or teacher to decide how they want to teach their kids history and which books they use. As for me, I've been using books from the popular Who HQ series to teach my son U.S. history. He started reading these books when he was 7 years old. I think they do a pretty good job of telling kids the story of important people and events from American history. But later when he's older and reaches his teens, I will encourage him to read books both like The Land of Hope as well as Howard Zinn's book, so he's aware of the different perspectives that are out there. I feel that my job as a parent and as a teacher is not to teach him to believe a particular narrative or viewpoint, but to help him develop the ability to process different viewpoints and arrive at his own conclusions. Now, if he ends up agreeing with me, that's great. But if he doesn't, I look forward to many spirited debates with him. Studying history is much more than memorizing important names and dates from the past. It's also about developing the ability to examine different facts and perspectives and arriving at your own conclusions and how they might apply to the world we live in today. Now, I know that there are some homeschoolers out there who may have decided to homeschool because they disagreed with a particular narrative that their public schools were teaching. And I hope this video has been helpful as you design the right U.S. history curriculum for your child. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.